There. Do that. Yes, I love it. Oh, we live.
All right. Oh, you up? Make sure this is correct. All right. So good day, everyone. Yep, we are live on Zoom. And to everyone watching online, I would like to thank you all for coming to our, everyone in person, and as well as everyone online. I would like to thank you all for coming to our symposium, the Karen Chambers Fellowship Symposium, as we get a chance to hear the research and the work of our two great graduate students of the Avery, Mr. Mateo Maria and Lauren Davila. I said that correct? All right. So the Karen Chambers Fellowship is a fellowship that we received funding for in 2020, named after the late Karen Chambers. Her family and friends gave us this funding to support graduate students who focus in African-American history as well as African diaspora studies. It's a cooperation between the Public History Department at the College of Charleston as well as with the Avery Research Center. And I'm proud to announce that over this next year, we'll be transforming the fellowship into a summer fellowship for scholars to come in who wants to focus on African-American history and culture and do research within our archives. That is the heart of the Avery, so that we're gonna extend that out to more community members to be able to come in and take on the Karen Chambers Fellowship to dive deep into the research here at the Avery. Today, we will have Mateo and Lauren present their research that they've been working on over the last year. And we also have a special presentation for all of our graduating seniors who are trying to leave us at the Avery. I believe we have 5 of them here with us today. And we're gonna do that special presentation afterwards. So again, welcome to the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. We look forward to hearing this research, and let's all ask engaging questions. If you are watching online on YouTube, you can ask your questions directly inside the chat box, and we'll get to those as they come up. We're gonna have our first presentation with Mr. Mateo to come up, one of our great Avery graduate students who I'm very sad to see leave us very soon. It's been a pleasure working with this young man over the last 2 years, and also has some great announcement as well. So thank you, and let's go to start off with Mateo.
All right, so buenas tardes todos. So first things first, before I kind of get started, I want to say, oh, the mic, all right, thank you. So first things first, before I get started, I'd like to thank everybody at the Avery. Like, y'all have been like absolutely great mentors for me, and I don't think that this product would have looked anything like it does now without all y'all's support and just general advice over the years. So thank you very much for everything y'all have done for me. And also thank you to the Chambers family too. I recognize they're not here in attendance, but I hope that they're able to come in and watch this video at some point. So thank you for financially supporting my research here and having faith in the work that I'm doing here. And I hope that this does the Chambers family proud. So first things first, to kind of get started, there really isn't a better place to talk about this research than the Avery Research Center, at least as far as places in South Carolina go. When we kind of talk about the history of like graduates at the Avery, we understand education is absolutely integral to understanding African-American activism, right? Take, for example, this image here, we have Septima Clark, who is teaching in the citizenship schools back in the 1960s. So the citizenship schools are going to be a mechanism available to people to teach people how to read and write in the middle of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And that's going to have dramatic ramifications in the Low Country and all throughout the Southeast. So education has been a tool to uplift, but it's also been used as a tool to oppress. I mean, a lot of people are familiar with Jim Crow education and how that has been a mechanism to coerce people into committing certain or working in very specific types of work and restricting other groups of people from participating in more middle-class kind of education and attaining careers as like lawyers and doctors and things of that variety. The reason we kind of start here is because when we think about Jim Crow and segregation, segregation in and of itself is not restricted to the African-American community. We actually see that in other communities such as Mexican Americans out in the Southwest. This image here is from the 1890s and shows what would have been called a Mexican school out in Trinidad, Colorado, or in the area surrounding it. And they didn't practice segregation as a matter of law. There was no policy that said that they had to segregate Mexican American students from white students. Instead, it was because of the outlooks of teachers, the general atmosphere of the schools themselves, and then self-preservation of parents withdrawing their students and then putting them in schools where they felt that their students were safer. At the same time, many teachers believed that Mexican-American students were not as capable of learning, in large part because of language barriers. So they didn't apply as many resources to them. And those tools then those schools that they got sent them to go work in places like rail yards and in cattle ranching. And of course, in Colorado, sugar beets. So we can kind of see in both communities, education has been an absolutely powerful tool of oppression. And that means that when we get closer towards the middle point of the 20th century, both communities are going to look to one another to kind of create different kind of mechanisms to change education as we understand it. So a great example of that is the Freedom Schools. In 1964, SNCC organized a group of effectively like a summer camp all throughout Mississippi in several different places that taught African-American students how to read, to improve those skills, and to talk about African-American history and culture, things that they would not have gotten from Jim Crow segregated education. Now, come the end of the summer, they don't do the Freedom Schools after the fact, but this is going to be deeply influential. And we can see that influence in Colorado in the Crusade for Justice. So this gentleman that we have up here is Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, and he was born and raised in Denver to a Mexican-American family. And he graduates from Manual High School, which is a Black and Mexican high school down on the Denver public school system. And he actually graduated at 17. He goes on to be a boxer with a strong winning record. And then he pivots a little bit and he goes into poetry. And then from poetry, he pivots again and starts getting involved in politics. He works with the Democratic Party and actually was an important member of helping to get John F. Kennedy elected in Denver County. But he kind of came to a place that he recognized that the Democratic Party did not well represent the needs of the Mexican-American community. So he breaks away, starts his own activist organization called the Crusade for Justice. The core tenet of the Crusade for Justice was that if there was a problem facing your community, you have the tools to fix it yourself. So for example, this red flag that we have here is from La Raza Unida Party, the United Race Party, talking about Chicana people, right? This party is going to be the alternative to the Democratic Party for Mexican-American people all throughout the Southwest. They're not just participating in local governments like city government. They're putting people forward for the Senate, for the House of Representatives, and even presidential candidates. So they create their own political party. They also turn around and create their own newspaper. They felt that publications like Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post weren't very well talking about Chicana activism. Well, they made a bilingual newspaper called El Gallo that did just that. So On top of all of that, the most important contribution that the Crusade for Justice made was philosophical. They organized this thing called the Chicano Youth Conference in 1969, where they got students from all across the Southwest at the high school and college levels, as well as political members, and then brought them to Denver to talk about general goals to unite all Chicana people across the Southwest. You better believe education was a very important part of that. They write this thing called El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, the spiritual plan of Aztlán, and they describe education must be relative to our people, i.e. history, culture, bilingual education, contributions, etc. Community control of our schools, our teachers, our administrators, our counselors, and our programs. So it's important to kind of note here that when we talk about Aztlán, in Aztec mythology, the Aztecs were from a long lost land somewhere up in the north called Aztlán. And then they go on and they settled in central Mexico, where the Aztec Empire would go on to be. So for the minds of Chicana people, Aztlán is their ancestral home, and they're looking to restore the glory of their own ancestors in the land that they would have distantly been from. And education was a very important tool for that. So 1969 is when this conference is going to take place, and they're going to be really quick about putting their money where their mouth is, drawing inspiration from African-American activists. They start what's called a freedom school that had the same kind of mechanisms that you saw in Mississippi. This freedom school, however, it went on for a couple of years and enrolled students at the high school levels and younger to practice their Spanish, to learn baile folclórico. These are folk dances, and also learning about Mexican-American history and culture in the Southwest and in Mexico as well. And also teaching these students to be proud activists and to stand up to injustice wherever they happen to find it. We see that in the March of 1969. There was a teacher named Harry B. Schaefer who worked in West High School. West Denver is, by the way, a historically Mexican-American community. 1/3 of the student population of West was Mexican-American. And he was notorious for saying highly racialized comments at particular students, mispronouncing names, making comments about the Crusade for Justice, which many of these students were affiliated with. Well, they didn't like that he was making these kind of comments. So some of these students that had been enrolled in the Freedom School turned to the Crusade and said, we want to do something about this. Well, whatever y'all want to do, we got your back. So come mid-March, for over the course of 2 days, it said that as many as 1,500 students, teachers, parents, and community members took to the streets requesting for Harry B. Schaefer to either be fired or transferred, and then pushing for a more inclusive education representative of Mexican-American students. So some of the people that I've interviewed will point out that despite how successful this actual protest may have been, most of those things have not been implemented in the schools today. But the consequence was more immediate than just thinking about developing education down the road inside Denver public schools. The Crusade relearned a lesson that they'd already known. If there's a problem, you have the tools to fix it. And they had the community support to create this alternative school. They're gonna name this school after a specific district in Mexico. Tlatelolco was once a city-state just outside of Mexico City that is now part of, outside of Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City today. And so it has this deep and Aztec history to it. And then with the arrival of the Spanish, Tlatelolco is also going to be the site of one of the very first Western-style higher education institutions in the entire Western Hemisphere. Then, of course, come the 1960s, activism wasn't just restricted to the United States. We see similar kinds of activism all throughout Latin America, and specifically in Mexico. In 1969, a bunch of students organized at Tlatelolco, protesting against the authoritarian pre-government of the time. So the government slaughtered 100 students and maimed hundreds more. And Tlatelolco then is the memory of the indigenous ancestry, of educational excellence, and manifests the spirit of the activist students that were slain there at Tlatelolco. So this right here is the front of Escuela Tlatelolco, named after this district. And we can kind of see similar kind of motifs. We have, of course, in the two wings here, we can see Aztec individuals instructing younger Aztec people. And then towards the middle column, we have a Chicano and a Chicana student graduating from the school. So even at the very end, the building yourself, they're trying to show you what the mission of this school is. The school itself operated on two primary principles, indigenous pride and activism. This element of indigenous pride was so deep, the very nature of the school, like structurally, was built around this. Instead of having grades from first to second grade, they called them casas, right? And they renamed them accordingly. Olmeca, Maya, Tolteca, Teotihuacano, Chichimeca, Mixteca, Zapoteca, and Nahuatlaca. So Aztecs, for those in a way that we might be more familiar with. And for those of us that are familiar with our Mesoamerican history, this is in the chronological order that each and every one of these groups would have lived in Mesoamerica. So for students enrolled in Escuela, they understand that the ancestors lived through them. They are carrying out the legacy of the ancestors in everything that they do. They also had a prominent Dia de los Muertos celebration every year, where they would block off certain streets walking towards the school. We have an image of that right up here to kind of show those indigenous motifs showing itself in community gatherings. Speaking of community gatherings, they were big fans of protest. You did not have to cut school to go to the protest. Instead, you did that together as a school. They would go and protest things like education reform and immigration policy. And towards the later years, they were known to participate in Black Lives Matter protests as well. Now, community for them was not just in the barrio, in your surrounding neighborhood. It was thinking about the Chicana activist movement all across the Southwest. Given where West Denver is, it's a site that has had a lot of gang violence over the years. So come summertime, there's anxiety about what we're going to do with these students instead of sending them out in the streets. Well, they would pull their resources and they went on trips to places like San Diego, California in 2006. When they got to San Diego, they went to the largest cemetery of migrant people coming into the United States in the entire country. And they also linked up with this group called Border Angels. For those of us that aren't familiar with Border Angels, they're an activist group that looks to support and advocate for people migrating into the country. They followed Border Angels to the places these people were coming into the country and distributed bottled waters along the way so that people don't die trying to pursue a better life than they might have enjoyed in Latin America. So here we can see these students are not just thinking about the people right in front of them, they're thinking big picture and even internationally as far as what a community means to them. Now, a school isn't worth much if it doesn't create successful students. And I think the best way to kind of understand that is to hear a description from one student herself. So pretty confident things she's describing there, right? She's thinking that one day she's going to go off and get a PhD. And that was not uncommon for graduates of Escuela Tlatelolco. One scholar's name was Elena Aragon de McKissick. And she found that this is reflected in empirical data as well. She interviewed 13 students and asked them, were you successful in accomplishing your goals? Well, 6 of those 13 said, yes, they were successful. But interestingly, 5 said they were not completely successful. In her interpretation, that's because she caught them in the middle point of attaining their goals. Maybe they got a job that they're really proud of. Maybe they were getting really good pay. Maybe they're giving back to the community in the way that they want to, but they're not done yet. They got a lot more that they still want to do. And she only got a sample of that. So there's more to be done. The sky is the limit, just like Estrella was describing. Now, despite the success of this school, it's not something that would have lasted forever. Founded in 1970, it would be operational for 47 years and closed down for 2 reasons. First of all, standardized testing. As we start moving deeper into the 2000s, standardized testing typically focused on things like reading and writing, language arts and science, right? And basically creating looking to score people on a certain metric to determine how much funding that they get. So for a school like Escuela, their mission is cultural, right? They're practicing Spanish. They're talking about history courses. That's really the core of what they do. And they didn't have very many resources to begin with. Now they kind of have to spread themselves even more thinly to address this, the standardized testing. This is going to be coupled with opening up a charter in 2004. Basically, they agree with DPS that by enlisting themselves as a charter school, they can get $800,000 of funding every single year if they perform well. At the same time as this, we have the housing crisis of 2008. All throughout the country, people are being foreclosed in their homes in places like New York and Los Angeles, and they're looking for places that are affordable that they can pick up and start life over again effectively. And they identified Northwest Denver as being the place to do that. So as they come and begin to purchase houses there and increase the property values, the Mexican-American families that have been there for generations can't afford to stay. They move out. The student enrollment rate for Escuela Tlatelolco dwindles. In 2014, Escuela Tlatelolco wasn't able to perform well enough on the standardized testings, so DPS pulled the funding. They closed their doors in 2017. But 47 years, that's almost half a century that this place was operating. And given how recently 2017 was, its legacy is still kind of up in the air. Think about how many people are going on now and getting more advanced degrees, who's teaching in the community, and who might be going on to participate in politics in the future. Those things are still yet to be determined. There's one person that I interviewed that her name was Monica Garcia. She used to teach at Escuela, but now she's a teaching coach in Adams County, which is in the suburbs of Denver. And mostly what she focuses on is trying to encourage teachers to find ways to create a more inclusive education for the students that are enrolled. And she's aware of one student that's constantly being pulled from class, right? Constantly in trouble for this thing, that, and the other. And every time the student's being pulled, they're saying, why are you pulling me? This student over here was doing the exact same thing, and I'm the one that's in trouble for this? This isn't fair. And in his mind, he felt that it was because he was Mexican that he was being treated that way, but other white students were not. So when you say things like that, that prompts bigger discussions. So they're going to organize a meeting with the principal, with the teaching coach, with the student, and of course with the parent. Well, when mom arrives to the meeting, she makes eye contact with Monica and she goes, I know you. What do you mean you know me? I don't know you. No, you do, because I used to go to Escuela. So this mother is continuing to instill the lessons of Escuela Tlatelolco in her son. He is standing up and advocating for himself because she learned to do that through the school. Now, to tie it all together, Escuela Tlatelolco was a possibility in no small part because of the mutual influence that African-American and Chicana activists had in one another. This is an image of a brown beret and a Black Panther at the steps of the Alameda Courthouse, which is a pretty prominent site for Black Panther history. And there's mutual support that we see there. There's mutual support we see in places like Escuela Tlatelolco and a lot of other places. This is just one small window to kind of underscore that legacy. If anybody is interested in kind of getting into the nitty gritty a little bit more and kind of getting an opportunity to learn more about my research, this project, and about this school, this QR code will take you to the digital exhibition that I put together to continue to preserve Escuela Tlatelolco, since the space itself isn't there anymore. So thank you very much.
So I also want to start off by thanking the Avery as well as the Chambers family for funding this research and allowing me to get to this point. My research was my thesis, so let's go ahead and start. I focused on the public memory of the domestic slave trade in Charleston. The domestic slave trade in the United States saw the forced migration of over 1 million enslaved people between the years 1810 and 1860. This trade forced enslaved African Americans from the upper to the lower South, or from one part of a state to another, and brought major economic prosperity to not just the South as a whole, but the entirety of the United States. States like South Carolina greatly profited off of this movement, as well as Charleston became a major hub of the domestic slave trade. So I focused my research on this public memory of slave trading offices, specifically in Charleston during the domestic slave trade, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. So in this project, I argue that slave traders' brutality against enslaved people through their participation in the domestic slave trade has been largely erased from public memory and the physical landscape as well, though it greatly contributed to the wealth, infrastructure, and legacy that they left behind. So I focus on slave traders James Jervey, Morton A. Waring, John H. Blake, and Alonzo J. White, as well as the sites connected to them. What you see here on the left is the present day building at 24 Broad Street. It was in the 1800s called 20 Broad Street, where their slave trading office was located. And on the right, you can see my public history project, which is a story map of all the locations of slave trading offices that I had researched. So this map I've created is a walking tour of different sites located on Broad and State Streets that were once the office locations of these prominent domestic slave traders in Charleston. And this map helps to identify each of those. So at each location on these little tabs, you can read about each different slave trader that worked in that building. Some locations have one or two slave traders and others have served as buildings for many more over the years. This map specifically identifies the 24 Broad Street of the building. This map is extremely important to the history of Charleston because it not only shows how closely tied the domestic slave trade was to the city and its business, but it allows people to actually walk the path that I've created. My goal with creating this tour was to allow tourists and locals alike to understand what they're walking past when they do appreciate the beauty of these buildings. It's to understand what exactly happened here and the business that occurred. So these important sites were extremely close in proximity to one another and made Charleston an extremely wealthy city, but there are no plaques, markers, or even accurate information to understand what enslaved people went through when they were being bought and sold on these streets. So forgetting that and not having any markers facilitates the continued forgetting of this history. This does a disservice to the public who deserves to hear about the work of enslaved laborers who built these spaces that do exist today. And if it were not for the work of these enslaved laborers, the money made from enslavement and from the slave trade, these spaces would not stand in Charleston today. So one of the points that I argue in my thesis is that many people walk past these sites and don't understand what they're walking past. That's for many reasons, but my walking tour does help aim to change that. So what you'll see here are two examples of slave sale ads found in Charleston Courier. I first came across this slave trading group of Jervey, Waring, and White during my internship at the Center for the Study of Slavery. My role there was to research slave traders during the early to mid 19th century. And I stumbled across a slave sale for 600 enslaved people, which Charleston had previously never seen a number this large before. The previous record was 300, also by the same slave trading firm. Prior, the largest sale, 300 is many enslaved people, but 600 would have brought massive crowds to the north side of the Exchange building. There would have been massive amounts of people on top of the already small and cramped space of this area. So after looking into these men individually and seeing just how involved they were in society and with this business, I decided this could be a topic that should be further explored. So this group operated at 24 Broad Street for many years between the years 1827 and 1840. At present day 24 Broad Street, they were well known in white Charleston society. These men held positions at court and banks, at their churches. Some even became the president of charities or societies, but all were domestic slave traders. In my thesis, I discussed the role of this public memory about this group in the present, and I argue the misremembering or lack of remembering all began while these men were still alive in the 19th century. By addressing these slave trading men as brokers, auctioneers, commissioners, or in other terms, we allow the truth of this business to be blurred. The terms that are being used to describe their historical descriptions of their former homes and these slave trading offices don't really allow for a public understanding. By not calling these men the terms that they are, a slave trader, when we discuss them, the public really loses a critical understanding of what actually happened. So during Jervey Waring and White's lifetimes, slave trading was not considered a deal breaker for entrance into Charleston high society. Because they were defined as businessmen and slave trading wasn't considered a large deal to elite white Southerners. When the slave trade was abolished, these men just carried on into other forms of business. Business continued as usual after the Civil War and at the end of the slave trade, meaning these sites of the slave trade did not stand unused for long. Jervey Waring and White's former office at present-day 24 Broad Street eventually closed. Business continued to be conducted, and over time, the building was bought by the Charleston Savings Institution in 1885, followed by its purchase by the Exchange Banking and Trust in 1922. And then after exchanging a few more hands, in 1989, it was purchased by the current owners, who have used it since then as various offices for lawyers. The owners occupying these former slave trading offices were able to move forward and ignore its slave trading past. The end of the slave trade did not bring shame or guilt to these former slave trading men or their peers, because after fighting for a war for the protection of slavery, there was nothing they felt they should have been ashamed for. The South's lack of remorse for slavery and the continued subjugation, commitment to the political, social, and economic subjugation of Black people meant there was no reason to memorialize something that they didn't see as a wrong. Over time, this meant that Broad Street's significance as a major site of slave trading was forgotten with each business that passed through, despite Charleston's historic commitment to the preservation and commemoration of the physical landscape. But just as the horrors of these men's business practices were ignored or subdued by their contemporaries, Charleston's political and economic power brokers have continued to, in the present, to de-emphasize the importance of slavery in Charleston's history, though it was the city's most significant enterprise for many centuries. But in order to profit off of these spaces, the current owners have curated an image of historic Charleston that does not include slavery, which was its dominant feature. So this is an example of one of my slides on the story map. So on each one that you click, I kind of give an overview, about 4 or 5 paragraphs on the slave traders that operated out of these buildings. This story map aims to change the present day public memory of slave trading offices located in these spaces. And this map kind of shows that slave traders didn't stick to just one location over the course of their careers, they moved to many. In the 1820s and 1830s alone, there were dozens of slave trading offices in just one block. This created somewhat of a slave trading district in this space. These offices were prime locations for traders as they sat in the heart of downtown, just steps away from banks, coffee houses, the exchange. Even through the 1840s and 50s, this remained true. So each location details this address, and you can read about each one. This one I have up as an example of 18 Broad Street. It's presently known as the People's Building. That building was built in the early 20th century, but it once held 1, 3, and 5 State Streets. All 3 of those locations were sites of the slave trade. The buildings do not exist, but for the map, I've still taken you to the People's Building so you can orient yourself and see the space that those buildings would have been in. So this was a lot of research to get to the bottom of where these buildings really were. Street addresses have changed over time, street names have even changed, so it's been a difficult and time-consuming process, but during my internship at the Center for the Study of Slavery with Dr. Powers, he had introduced me to Doreen Larimer, who's a local historical deeds researcher. So I spent my last summer at the Register of Deeds looking at these locations, and I was able to identify 9 different ones for this project. So when it came to the location of 20 Broad Street, that took a majority of my time. The photo that you see here is an example of a screenshot of the tax mapping system showing these numbers. Each individual parcel on here has a number. this is present day, but as you go back in time, it will, if the lot's been subdivided, you can kind of tell with these lines. So over time, as you go back, you can trace through deed research. So to do this, you have to look at the exact dimensions of each parcel, look at which place is budding and bounding, and that can be a lot going back 200 years. It doesn't usually come easy, but I was able to locate 9 more. It leaves a lot more room for other work to be done, as there were many other addresses even outside of the bounds of this picture, about 40 in total that I was able to locate that didn't even make the cut for this. So this was an extremely pervasive business. I also really focused in Charleston newspaper archives, which are extremely helpful for this and led me to a lot of biographical information on these men. So these are a couple of examples of the buildings that were used in the slave trade. No plaques or markers. These 2 on the left that you see are private homes now, and the blue building is currently up for rent, but I believe it formerly held lawyers' offices. So I do want to conclude by saying that combined with the passing of time and the obscuring of the public landscape in downtown Charleston, these locations of the trade have been turned into a variety of places: homes, art galleries, boutiques. They make no mention of the spaces that they once were for several reasons. But this lack of contextualization of these sites allows people in the present to ignore what happened in the past. Without reckoning with these sites of Charleston's past, we stand to lose a history that tells a fuller picture of Charleston's story and how and what it has become today. As time has passed, Charleston has chosen to commemorate blurred versions of the true history of Charleston and obscure the crucial role that the domestic slave trade did play in its foundation. I hope by creating this tour, which I will have the link to, more of the public is able to gain a fuller understanding of the public landscape.
All right, thank you both. Wow, that's great, absolutely amazing research, and we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. And also, as we open it up for questions, I want to give a quick shout out to Mr. Eric Chambers from the Chambers family, who's watching online with us right now. So thank you again for that research. Do we have any questions from the audience? Comments?
I know both of you work part-time at the old state farm, right? So Lauren. Oh, thanks. So I know that both of you work part-time at the Old Slave Mart Museum. And this question is specifically for Lauren, because it looked like from the story map that a lot of the sites you identified are really close to the Slave Mart Museum. So how have you been able to incorporate your thesis research to the tours that you offer at the Slave Mart Museum?
So I don't really bring it up unless it comes up in a question, just because the research of these story maps only goes up until about 1845. And the Old Slave Mart Museum opens up 1856. If someone asks me a more specific question on before or after that time period, I absolutely bring that up. One of the men who held slave sales at the Old Slave Mart, Alonzo J. White, was a member of this group. So it is a nice segue into talking about that research as well. But yeah, it was a kind of a later period. So I do talk about it occasionally.
Thank you both for your presentations. I just wanted to ask, like, what if you have future plans, like, for example, that question made me think of, it would be really cool if there was an exhibit at the Old Slave Mart Museum, sort of highlighting like precursors or something, where you could feature your research. Or Mateo, I know we've talked a little bit, but I'd be curious just to hear what are other ideas or goals that you have for continuing.
Okay, well, as of right now, I'm in the second stage of interviews with the Texas Historical Commission, where I'd be working as as an educator for the French Legation House. So that hasn't been, like, I'm still kind of waiting on a couple pieces to fall in line. So that isn't totally set in stone yet. I'm interested in eventually pursuing a PhD, but I'm trying to get a feel for kind of when I feel ready to do that. And I'm not totally sold when that might be if I decide to do it. But yeah, so that's pretty much what I kind of have going on right now.
I think it would be a great idea to add the research I've done to the Old Slave Mart. That's really up to the people at the city, but this is research that I would absolutely want to continue at the Register of Deeds. Now that I've been taught the research and how to do it, it's something that I think needs to be added to. I do plan on keeping the tour up to add to so the public can view it. That's really been my goal. I graduate and I'm just going to keep working at the Old Slave Mart. So hopefully I can have conversations with them about adding it.
All right, awesome. We have a comment from YouTube that I would like to read. It came in from a scribe, God bless. It said, just moved to Charleston from Denver, and I am heartened to see this presentation. Escuela was a wonderful presence in the community and is sorely missed.
Full-heartedly agree.
And Lauren, I have a question for you. As far as, because of course, a lot of my family came in through Charleston Ports because this is where John C. Calhoun wanted to bring a lot of his folk through. So as you're doing the research and he's finding the different places, have you start seeing where people would come down? Have you start seeing like the buyers who had like frequented the different spots?
So I want to go on and get a PhD, and that's kind of the next avenue that I want to look into. I thought with the sale of the 600 enslaved people, that was a very large estate sale, and I couldn't really find out at the time I had where they came from or who purchased them. But I think that would be an awesome avenue for more research for sure.
And well, I guess my next part of my question was like, where were some of these people moving to or being moved to? I know you said a lot of them came from different parts of the state. So where were they really moving?
So I saw in a lot of the slave sales I looked at Columbia to Charleston, and then from Charleston just across the deeper South. So Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. When they got to Columbia, they were most likely, I didn't look into this, but just as the domestic slave trade goes, they were coming from places like Maryland or Virginia.
Lastly, what were the businesses that they actually went into after they?
So I don't mention him in this presentation, but you can kind of read more about it on the tour. John Y. Stock became known for the stock and the cotton shipping business, but he got all of his wealth from the domestic slave trade for about 35 years before he actually went into that business. And that's the case for many of them. In my thesis, I also discuss how they intermarry, can like join up their wealth and then start businesses in the later 1800s that they used off of slave trading. So they go into, some of them retired onto their plantations and just decided to stop working after. And then some went into shipping businesses and other kinds of things like that.
Great. Any other questions? Well, thank you again for the presentation. Oh, hold on one second.
Question from Mateo. Regarding the curriculum for the school, you did research about what was actually being taught, or lesson plans, or any kind of examples of student work over the years?
Yeah, so it's Escuela changed a lot over the years. It kind of ebbed and flowed. Like when it first started, it had like everything from pre-K up to like a bachelor's degree. And then when you start getting towards like the 80s, it kind of cuts down to just high school. And then when it closed, they were back to high school, but they weren't offering a bachelor's degree anymore. So a lot of the materials that I had came from the Denver Public Library. They have a collection of files from Escuela Tlatelolco, and it's the only one that I'm aware of. And they had a number of documents concerning curriculum for the college degree from back in the days that was like in the 1970s. It was a degree like some of the courses that they offered were like sociology of Chicano education and things like that, or Mexican American history. So they generally focused a lot on a lot of study about like social problems impacting Mexican Americans living in and around Denver. A lot of literature about the contributions of Hispano people that would have lived in the Four Corners area. That was so in a general sense, that's kind of what they focused on as far as that side of things go. I wasn't able to see a lot about what it would have looked like for the grade school years. But something that I did encounter, which I thought was, which I didn't have, I wasn't quite sure how to fit it in the paper, but they had a community garden. And part of their approach with the community garden is it was something that they did as part of their science classes, teaching kids to reconnect with the earth and reconnect with their indigenous heritage of people that worked with the earth, that planted and self-sustained. So these kind of motifs definitely impacted the curriculum as well.
Let's give them one more round of applause. And now I'm gonna welcome up our great executive director, the one and only, Dr. Tamara Butler.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. How we doing? Wow. Try that again. How we doing? All right, there we go. Lovely. I'm just a little spot on the thing. So I wanted to take this time out to welcome you once again to Avery, but also to honor our graduate and our graduating seniors who've been invaluable here at Avery. Their times have varied from like a couple of months to a couple of years. And so I'm going to see if I can do it in terms of who's been here the shortest to the longest. We'll see if I can make this happen. All right, so I'd like to welcome you, and we want to present our cords to our graduates. So our first graduate that we would like to bring to the stage is Anne Spong.
Yeah.
Anne has been working in our archive and interpretation with our archive interpretation team, but also has been working with programming. So there's a couple of days where sometimes she will be moving, she'll be having the vacuum cleaner or she'll be moving the table. So we want to thank you, Anne, for your flexibility. We also have Lauren Curry to the stage.
Y'all get her some bells, I promise.
Right. Lauren is a little church mouse around Avery that sometimes we don't know is here until she pops her head around the column in our archive room. But what we do appreciate is that she has a lot of Christmas cheer that she brings to the home of the Grinches, because there's a lot of Grinches and Grouches here at Avery. So we want to thank you, Lauren, for your work in the archives and also with bringing all the joy that you have to Avery. Another graduate that we'd like to honor is Mateo Marita. Mateo's been with us the longest, to the entire time of his graduating, of his graduate career. Do you have something? Okay, so I'm actually gonna turn it over to Erica and let Erica do her thing.
Cool. Well, thank you, Dr. Butler. Yeah, Mateo's been with us the longest, and I think I was working with Mateo on his first day at Avery. And he has just been a wonderful addition. He's one of the best graduate assistants that I have had the pleasure of working with. And his support of Avery has not just been specific to Avery. He's also been a huge dedicated volunteer to the Low Country Action Committee, which was started by myself and some other former Avery graduate assistants. And I think it speaks to the legacy that the Avery Normal Institute kind of laid down in terms of instilling a sense of social responsibility as well as educational excellence in its students. And Mateo spoke to that a lot when he talked about Escuela today. So I just wanted to also present Mateo with a certificate of appreciation from the Low Country Action Committee. And we are promoting Mateo as an honorary member of the Solidarity Network. so that you can continue to engage with the Low Country Action Committee after you leave South Carolina. You can participate in some of our political education discussions while you find a new organization to, be your home in Texas or wherever you end up. Thank you, Mateo.
We're gonna get photos. So oh Lord, don't take out the thing, the screen right there. We want to honor also our second Karen Chambers Fellow, Lauren Davia.
Okay.
And last but not least, right, we have one person who joined our team a little late in their career, but we're not gonna hold that against them because they've came in and been a really dynamic part of the Avery family and hope that you won't forget us. And so we want to welcome Montana James to the stage. All right, well, as we said, the Karen Chambers Fellowship will make a transformation. And it's going to turn into something that will hopefully bring more scholars to Avery, to the College of Charleston, to the city of Charleston, in hopes of engaging our archives, maybe even engaging special collections and all the dynamic stories that we have here that's been really brought out by our students here. And so we want to thank everybody for coming out. We hope that y'all will enjoy the rest of these cupcakes because I'm not taking them home. And we also want to just thank you all for thinking of Avery as a good place to work, as a good place to do research, and as a good place to bring friends. So every now and then we have friends and family drop by. So we're grateful to each and every one of you, and we look forward to seeing you all this time so next year. Thank you.